4. John Rabe was not happy with his breakfast this morning. He had not been happy with his meals ever since Liang, a substitute cook, had taken over the kitchen about a month ago. "Boy," Rabe exclaimed at the dining table, chewing. "The ham and the fried eggs taste like fish." "Well, chicken can no help, master," Liang peeped from inside the kitchen and replied in his delightful Shanghai pidgin English. "Present time no got proper chow, only got fish." "But the butter tastes of fish too. Do you think the cow's eating fish as well?" Rabe asked incredulously. "My no savvy, master. My want to ask him." Rabe almost spewed the food out of his mouth. That was one of the idiotic joys he had to put up with living in China. For how long now? Almost 30 years, with only a few brief respites back in Germany. 5 years more than the time he had lived in Hamburg, his hometown, and longer than anywhere else in the world combined. Wouldn't that make him a Chinese, sort of? All but a few foreigners had left Nanking, as had the richest Chinese residents. Even the Generalissimo and his American-educated wife Mei Ling had packed up and gone about a week ago, leaving behind a city without a government, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of civilians, poorly armed troops without hope. The civilians too poor, too old, or too sick to join the exodus, the troops defending a city abandoned by the central government and the high command. The exodus had started half-heartedly back in mid-August when the first wave of Japanese warplanes began their bombing runs on Nanking. The reluctant, sluggish trickle of evacuees soon developed into an earnest, maddened deluge when it was learned how ugly the battles in Shanghai had gotten. The air raids were frequent and deadly, and the Imperial Army drew ever closer to the city walls. That was when he returned from the safety of Beidaihe, the seaside summer resort north of Tianjin, where he was vacationing with Dora, the child whose sweetheart he had married in Shanghai back in 1909. Why hadn't he left? Was it because he loved adventure so much that he would go out of his way to court oncoming danger with open arms, while just about everybody else was running as far away to safety as their purse and legs could carry them? Adventure may indeed have been in his bones. His father, a ship's captain, had filled his little son's impressionable mind with tales of the sea and the exotic ports of faraway lands he had visited. It was perhaps this restlessness in his blood that had sent him to work in the Luchenzo Marquis, a Portuguese colony in Mozambique, not long after high school. A bout of malaria forced him to return to Hamburg a few years later. But once recovered, he set out again in 1908, this time for Peking, China. Then the strangest, most inexplicable thing happened. Upon setting foot in this ancient country of the Orient, Rabe seemed to have found a permanent moor. The restlessness in his blood was cured. It was as if he were home again. Okay, he admitted he needed to stay to protect his property, his walled residence with a lush garden, the German school he had established, and the property of the Siemens Company branch in Nanking. He had been its director since 1931 after running Siemens branch offices first in Peking and then in Tianjin for a number of years. But that couldn't be all there was to it. The company didn't and wouldn't expect him to get himself killed on his behalf. He didn't have the least desire to put his life at risk for the sake of either the company's or his own property. That would be idiotic beyond the palest ray of reason or common sense. The answer had to lie elsewhere. He felt that the large, terrified eyes of his Chinese employees and servants, about 30 in all, including their immediate families, were on him, their master. If he stayed, they would stay and stick to the end. Most of them were from the war-torn northern provinces. They would rather just huddle here around him because they had no home to go back to up north, even if he offered them money for the trip. Many a time since September he had sat with them in the dugout in the garden and held a trembling child of theirs in each hand through the long hours of an air raid. He knew what it felt like. The people of his host country had treated him well for 3 decades now. Didn't he owe them something, especially now when times were bitterly hard for them? These people didn't know where to go and didn't have the means to flee. They could be in danger of being slaughtered in great numbers. Shouldn't he make an attempt to help them, save a few at least? These were his own people now, he concluded. Won't they? They needed him. Yet the breakfast was really horrible. Liang, you'll have to do better with the lunch and dinner, or he was cut off by loud explosions and machine guns sputtering in the distance. The windows shook. Rabe jumped out of his chair and hurried to the window. Even without the heart-piercing sirens in the air, he knew that waves of Japanese warplanes would be overhead in a matter of minutes. Let's get to the dugouts, Rabe shouted, grabbing the emergency bag by the dining table. It was filled with the most basic first aid supplies. Liang, Han, his capable and trusted assistant, and the rest of his people began to hurry out of the house toward the garden. Terrified men, women, and children were scrambling for shelter all over the garden. There were over 100 of them. Come down, Rabe shouted. Plenty of time. Either they didn't hear him or couldn't understand his German-accented Chinese. They kept running. About a dozen of them threw themselves under the flag, a 20 by 10 feet piece of canvas with a swastika painted on it. Back in mid-November, Rabe had his servants set it up facing the sky in hope of deterring Japanese bombers. So far, it had worked. No bombs had hit his residence directly during the numerous air raids. Having directed people to whatever shelter that could be found in the garden, Rabe hurried to the dugout with a sign hanging from a pole above its entrance. Siemens China Corporate, Nanking, office hours from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. He winked at the sign knowingly. The Siemens board of directors would be happy to know that their Nanking representative had shortened his day down to 2 hours only. Like the other two in the garden, this dugout covered with planks and dirt was no bomb-proof, but it could provide protection against shrapnel. It had been designed for 12 occupants. Now more than 30 people were squeezed in it. Women with nursing babies were sitting in the middle, then women with bigger children than men. Huddled in a corner was a fat telegraph operator who used to elbow his way to the best middle seat every time there was an air raid. But he had been on his best behavior ever since Rabe threatened to kick him out. His neighbor, a middle-aged cobbler who had just sat down next to the fat telegraph operator, grinned at Rabe warmly and mouthed, "How are the new boots I made you?" Rabe gave him the thumbs-up sign. Most of the people in the dugout were donning a crude muslin face mask, a handkerchief, or a little towel, just in case. Warplanes droning overhead now. A whistle cut through the air and bombs exploded not too far away. Homes must be collapsing in flames, bodies charred and scattered. Rabe didn't need to go outside the dugout to see. He had seen it happen too many times before. He could smell it in the air. Rabe turned to look at the small girl sitting next to him. She was shivering, and the eyes in her soot-painted face were filled with fear. He took her hand and held it in his own. Another whistle split the air, followed by a deafening explosion. The ground underneath him trembled. Dirt fell all around like a brown waterfall. He had just celebrated his 55th birthday on November 23rd. Among the gifts he received was a very lovely scarf and the promise given by a Chinese friend of Han's of 2 trucks with 100 canisters of gasoline and 200 sacks of flour. Wouldn't that be marvelous? A gift like that every day would mean that the tens of thousands of refugees camping inside the safety zone would not have to go hungry or shiver in the cold. Another round of explosions thundered close by. Rabe turned to check on the girl next to him again. She looked up and gave him a nervous, toothy smile.